initially it was morphine. That was always sort of the gold standard of pain treatment, right? For any sort of long-term severe chronic pain. And then it's, a lot of people don't realize it's one chemical step to go from morphine to heroin.
My team of beat officers that were walking the beat in downtown Victoria were some of the first officers to detect illicit fentanyl in the street supply back in 2012. And at that point, we really thought this was just fentanyl that had been diverted from medicinal supply. And of course, it wasn't at all. We threw everything we could at it as far as enforcement, and it didn't really work.
Back then, the fentanyl overdose crisis really was not front and center. Finding, people are buying fentanyl and we're finding it in our heroin. So back then it was heroin. And then suddenly it hit us that, wow, if this is actually happening, this is going to change the game. And it certainly has.
Some people are as young as 10 that are dying from drug overdose, and some people are as old as 59. And that's just the leading cause of death between those two age groups.
Where would a 10-year-old get access to this stuff?
Well, interesting question. I think
10 years old?
That's right.
I was trying to think of what the hell I was doing when I was 10 years old, but that's crazy to me.
Now with fentanyl, the structure of it's actually so simple. It's such a, I guess, truncated or chopped down version of the morphine backbone that to make it synthetically is almost too easy.
Again, everything that you guys are probably going to say, I'm probably going to go right over my head, but I'll try to keep up and see what I can do. Yeah. But thank you guys for coming on.
No problem.
Okay, cool. So I think, it's great that we're starting with this topic just because it's so near and dear to my heart. So essentially we're talking about the overdose crisis that we're finding ourselves in, well, essentially North America wide now. And the terminology varies depending on who you speak to. So some people refer to it as a drug overdose crisis. Other people may describe it as toxic supply or toxic drug poisoning. And there's sort of different connotations with either one, but we'll use those terms interchangeably. So whatever whoever is comfortable with. Sure. When I started my training, so I'm a psychiatrist, and I did a fellowship in addiction medicine. So that's my subspecialty training. And my fellowship was in 2014 year. And back then, the fentanyl overdose crisis really was not front and center. And really nobody had heard about it. And certainly for me, going into an addiction medicine program, I wasn't expecting to lose a lot of patients. I went into it because it was interesting. I enjoyed the pharmacology. I enjoyed the behavioral science around it. And I remember sort of in the first couple months of my fellowship, I was doing an interview with a young person. And it was with one of my mentors, Dr. Steve Mathias. And this kid he was like 16 years old, and I was asking him about his drug use history, and he was like, yeah, I'm using fentanyl. I was like fentanyl patches? It was just bizarre. And I knew that, okay, patches, there was some diversion with fentanyl patches potentially, but it really wasn't a source of opioids that people typically use. And he was like, no, we're finding, people are buying fentanyl and we're finding it in our heroin. So back then it was heroin. And then suddenly it hit us that, wow, if this is actually happening, this is going to change the game. And it certainly has. And it's sad because we've lost countless people. So right now in British Columbia, about 6 to 7 people a day are dying of drug poisoning. There was a statistic that is really interesting for me and kind of hits home. And basically it's that unregulated drug toxicity is the leading cause of death in British Columbia for persons aged 10 to 59. And it accounts for more deaths than homicides, suicides, accidents, and natural disease combined. That's remarkable.
It's crazy.
10 years old?
Yeah, between 10 to 59.
Would that be they started when they were 10, or do you think that would?
That means that
familial.
Some people are as young as 10 that are dying from drug overdose, and some people are as old as 59, and that's just the leading cause of death between those two age groups. Thankfully, there's not a great number of 10-year-olds and teenagers that are dying. There's some, but the majority of people in that age group is actually, I think, 30 to 59.
That's right.
Yeah.
And 70% of those are males.
That's right.
Where would a 10-year-old get access to this stuff?
Well, interesting question. I think
10 years old?
that's right. So the youngest person I've personally have had who's died, youngest patient who's died, was 14 years old, and the oldest was in their 70s. And oftentimes, I think when we think about fentanyl use and drug addiction, et cetera, we think about the downtown east side and that particular demographic. But I've had teenagers from the suburbs. I've had university students. I've had young professionals. So I think addiction doesn't discriminate, and you have deaths across all demographics. But yeah, it's disturbing, isn't it? Like when a 10-year-old dies.
I was trying to think of what the hell I was doing when I was 10 years old, but that's crazy to me. 10?
Yeah. So what's also interesting is that addiction is not new, and opioid addiction is not new to British Columbia, right? Like the downtown east side has always had the downtown east side issue, but I think what's changed the game is fentanyl, essentially. So it's the substance that's being used that's so deadly. And then the question that often comes up is, okay, like how did this happen? Where did this come from? Who's we had a sense of heroin. Okay, like it's cultivated in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. That's where the poppy fields are, and it's processed and it's brought across Middle East, Europe, and it's imported into North America, and that's where it comes from. So people generally had a sense of that, but fentanyl, it doesn't grow on plants. So where is it made? How does it get here? And how did we get here? So maybe we can just dive into that, Conor.
Sure.
Actually, before we even go there, Conor, sorry, Korey, I think it's also interesting to think about what exactly is fentanyl. We hear the word often, but you want to describe in terms of as general terms as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And even before touching on that, actually, I wanted to mention when you're talking about how the epidemic essentially started with heroin use and even morphine before that. And
that's right.
I mean, people being prescribed oxycodone, the abuse of those things. My understanding of it is, as you said, morphine, a lot of, naturally derived opioids are cultivated in Afghanistan, shipped all over the world for use, whether it's prescribed use or illicit use through some black markets. But initially it was morphine. That was always sort of the gold standard of pain treatment, right? For any sort of long-term severe chronic pain. And then it's a lot of people don't realize it's one chemical step to go from morphine to heroin. And all of a sudden you go up as much as 8-fold in terms of potency. So you have morphine, this super potent, already really strong, potentially dangerous painkiller. And you carry out one very easy chemical reaction that honestly, pretty much anybody could do if they had the right tools. And from that you can get heroin, and it's a huge jump in potency. And from there, the issue is, of course, you have to get your hands on the morphine and sort of the morphine skeleton, that molecule in the first place. And to do that synthetically, it just doesn't make sense. The only good way to do that is to have a source of opium, raw opium. Whereas now with fentanyl, the structure of it's actually so simple. It's such a, truncated or chopped down version of the morphine backbone that to make it synthetically is almost too easy for a trained chemist. To get your hands on the raw materials, of course, or the equipment is not a trivial task for someone at the street level or just a non-chemist, right? These are still regulated chemicals, regulated compounds. But the actual chemistry that goes into it, and if you look at the structure of the molecule, it's just so simplified. And from kind of still controlled, but nonetheless commodity chemicals, it's essentially a 3-step process to make it. That's 3 chemical reactions, whereas to make the morphine backbone, I think the most efficient synthesis of morphine from small chemical building blocks, commodity chemicals, is, I believe it's 10 or 12 steps. And low yields, again, specialized equipment the whole way, whereas fentanyl can just be made so easily.
Interesting. And sorry, just to provide some more background, it's just so people understand that, okay, so, and let's step back a little bit more big picture. In terms of opioids, what are opioids? In our body, we have opioid receptors, right? The most common one's a mu receptor, but they're in the brain and other parts of the brain, but other parts of the body, but primarily the ones we worry about are in the brain. And we have what's called endogenous sort of opioid system. three main ones: enkephalins, dynorphins, and endorphins. But they bind to our natural opioid receptors, and they produce certain effects in the brain. Right? One of those effects is relief of pain. So that's the internal system. And then what we've done sort of historically through the poppy plant is we've been able to develop what's called exogenous or external opioids. And these are much, much more potent than what we have naturally in our body, right? And one of the effects of molecules binding to these opioid receptors is a sense of euphoria that develops as well. So I think that's where the quote unquote addictive potential of opioid molecules as a class has come to be. Okay, so that's the opioid system. Now, the most common one that we use sort of in hospital may be morphine. And the primary source of morphine is the poppy plant, right?
Yep.
That's where you get the backbones, like you're saying, and then it's synthesized into morphine. And then historically, the quote unquote drug of abuse or the opioid of abuse, the one that's been primarily used illicitly has been heroin.
Yep.
Which the primary source again is the poppy seed, but again it's a different chemical process that turns it into heroin, which is much more potent than morphine. Okay, so now fentanyl is a completely different ball game, right?
Yeah. So getting back to your original question too, in terms of structure, it's kind of fascinating from a chemist's perspective, I guess. You look at the structure of morphine or the structure of naturally derived opiates.
Right.
And it's this tetracyclic backbone. So there's 4 ring systems. They're all bridged. They're all fused. And it's this quite complex and very densely functionalized compound. And that's why it's made in nature and not by chemists still to this day, right? Whereas you look at fentanyl and it's sort of this fully stripped down structure. There's still a few rings involved in the structure, but in terms of the actual disconnections that you can make as a chemist, it's quite easy to understand and quite easy to see. But the really fascinating part about it is when you were talking about the receptors within the body and how morphine and these exogenous agonists kind of work. Morphine adopts this sort of T shape when you actually look at it 3-dimensionally. It's a sort of T-shaped molecule. And then you look at fentanyl, and it's, again, this fully stripped down version, not much functionality on it. But if you look at the 3D shape, it's almost sort of this L shape, and it fits enough of the shape of morphine that it acts very, very potently on those same receptors. Right. And it's really interesting stuff. But again, it's concerning how simple the molecule is. Right.
And in terms of potency equivalent, when we convert one opioid to another, so if we're converting clinically, because these medications we do use clinically for pain as well, and I'm a pain physician as well, and a lot of what I do is manage complex pain in addition to addiction medicine. So oftentimes in pain medicine we do opioid rotation, so we go from one opioid to another. Then when I convert if I'm going from fentanyl to morphine, we usually use the order for 100. So we consider fentanyl being 100 times more potent than morphine. Okay, so that's the context for fentanyl, and then there are other fentanyl analogs as well, and we'll get into those in a minute. And Conor, I want to get to you, but I want to provide one other piece of context. Is what was interesting when I first started practicing addiction medicine, again in my fellowship training and then sort of in my career. So at first it was people using heroin, who had never used fentanyl before. And then it turned out to be people who were using fentanyl, using heroin, and unknowingly their heroin was laced with fentanyl. And then it got to the point where you couldn't find heroin that wasn't laced with fentanyl, right? And then we got to a point where heroin became more and more difficult to find, and it was only fentanyl. And then I came across a whole cohort of people who had never used heroin before. They started, fentanyl is the only opioid that they've used. And now we have fentanyl analogs, and we have other additives, etc. Conor, how did we get here? Where did this stuff come from?
Yeah, right. It's a crazy story.
Yeah.
So, building on what Korey was talking about, we were in a time when heroin was essentially the number one illicit opioid on the street.
Right.
Somebody who was a down drug user was using heroin.
Right, and down is sort of the
Street term
lay
for
street term for opioids.
down is exactly a street term for opioids, and up is a street term for cocaine or methamphetamine. So
yeah, actually, and people use side for methamphetamine, don't they?
up is for sideways for
That's
meth.
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
so heroin was the primary drug being used. There was, however, some significant amount of use of oxycodone, prescription opioids. And there was a real famous one that was an oxycodone 80 milligram.
That's right.
Which was produced by a particular pharmaceutical company. They were widely used. They were green, called greenies, and they were 80 milligrams. Very, very powerful, commonly used. They were crushed up and snorted, or crushed up and injected, sometimes mixed with heroin, sometimes used interchangeably by people who were using heroin and oxycodone. And governments were successful, however, in actually getting the oxycodone 80 milligram tablet or pill banned in Canada because it was considered just to be too powerful. And that was meant to be a correct move to actually reduce addiction by taking away this particular source of drugs. But one thing I will tell you right now is organized crime groups, they find a way around almost everything we ever try to do. And we, as people in this society, continually do things that have unintended consequences. Unintended consequences has been a huge part of the problem we've been facing with this whole crisis. The unintended consequences here was that once those 80 milligram pills were pulled off the legitimate market, organized crime groups said, hey, we're well connected, particularly Vancouver and mainland China. We're connected with chemists who can actually make fake 80 milligram pills for us. And we don't have the oxycodone to use, but they can produce this fentanyl stuff, which apparently is super powerful, pretty easy to make, and we can make fake 80s. And so that was in many ways how fentanyl first arrived in our country, was in the form of fake 80 milligram pills. So now you've got heroin, you've got fake 80 pills, they're both circulating at the same time. Then organized crime groups said, hang on a second, let's build upon this idea. Why don't we just also get fentanyl in the raw form or the powder form, and we can either make our own pills here in British Columbia or other parts of North America, or we can just start inserting it into heroin. We can buy less heroin, add some fentanyl, bump it up, make it more potent, more powerful, and push that on onto the street. And so what I'm talking about, this basically started around 2010 and carried on right through. By 2013, 2012, that's when my team of officers first saw fentanyl. We thought it was going to be heroin, determined that it was fentanyl. By 2015 to 2016, we were in a full-blown wave of fentanyl coming at us from China. So organized crime groups essentially saw that this was incredibly lucrative. A very small amount of fentanyl, of course, can provide that so-called euphoric effect to a huge number of people. And there were certain things in play in society that made it very, very easy for them to get fentanyl. For one thing, it's a heck of a lot easier to get fentanyl from a big city in China because you literally can order it and online and get it shipped by FedEx or UPS or DHL or a freight forwarding company from a city in mainland China over to Vancouver. So the package just gets packaged up and shipped just like you would buy something from Amazon and forwarded either on a aircraft or on a marine vessel, and it arrives in Vancouver. That's a lot easier than if you want to get your hands on a kilogram of heroin from Afghanistan. You just can't order, you can't call up the Taliban and order a kilo of heroin. You have to be a well-connected, globally active organized crime group to get heroin from Afghanistan. Completely different than mail ordering something from China. That was a massive game changer, and I actually call it the great equalizer. It meant that you could either be a member of an organized crime group and be bringing in fentanyl, or you could be a schmo in your basement, and you can just go on even the ClearNet or the dark web, and you can find the fentanyl producer. There were thousands of fentanyl trafficking companies organized or operating in China, and they would just send that fentanyl over to North America. So all of a sudden, as you mentioned, we went from a little bit of fentanyl supplanting the heroin to fentanyl replacing the heroin. And in fact, I was looking at the numbers the other day. So the Drug Analysis Service is the laboratory run by Health Canada, and they analyze any samples that the police seize on the street. We send it to the Drug Analysis Laboratory, and they give us a finding back as to what drug we submitted. So in 2012, there was about, I think it's 217 samples of fentanyl sent in to the drug lab by all police in Canada. That's 2012, 217. By 2023, the number is, in 1 year, over 13,000.
Right.
So from 200 something samples to 13,000. So I did the calculation. That's a 6,000% increase in the availability of fentanyl from 2012 to 2023. It just exploded into the market, and you're entirely right. Now you can barely find heroin. It's completely replaced heroin.
Yeah. And also, you can imagine, like, a package of heroin, the equivalent package of fentanyl is going to be 100 times smaller.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So just transporting, smuggling, etc., it just becomes so much easier. What's interesting to me is, like, there must have been, and obviously you know this far better than anybody, a robust organized crime system for the for the heroin market, heroin trade. So what happened to the people who were trading heroin? Did they just get replaced, or was there like a drug war, or what exactly happened in that situation?
Yeah, so you're right. As I mentioned, bringing in heroin from Afghanistan, that required a globally connected organized crime group. Many of these groups were at the very top, were members of either global Chinese organized crime groups or Italian mafia crime groups in Montreal, or biker gangs in Western Canada.
So I'm sorry, these are people who are bringing heroin into...
Bring heroin into the country.
Okay.
And they essentially have some level of cooperation, and they would bring the heroin. I mean, it has to make its way all the way from Afghanistan through Europe, typically, or even down into the southern hemisphere, and then back up into North America. It can take 6 months to get a kilogram of heroin. They stayed involved in that to some extent, and then they also pivoted into the fentanyl arena as well, and they became involved in bringing large amounts of fentanyl. So they might get involved in bringing 100 kilograms of fentanyl or 50 kilograms of fentanyl from China. They would order it sometimes the same way everybody else would. So my team investigated a organized crime group that were based out of Montreal. They moved to Victoria. And all they did was they had the connections in China, so they didn't have to go online and randomly pick a chemical company and not know who they were dealing with. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. They had been to China. They spoke the language. They set up a system where they would simply use FedEx to deliver the packages to Victoria. And I'm talking kilograms at a time, but one a week. And then they would repackage that, mix it with other additives, and push it out into the market. So they stayed involved. Organized crime stayed involved, and they're more involved now than ever before. But as I mentioned, there also was an equalization happening, where you didn't need to be an organized criminal, because fentanyl producers and traffickers were on the clear net, and then you could just order it. So you could be. My team also investigated a guy who was a UVic student, and his part-time job was bringing in things like fentanyl and MDMA and repackaging it in his apartment and then delivering it to students in the southern part of Vancouver Island. Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow. Okay. But it can't be that easy. Like, if I'm a drug lord and I see that a UVic student is sort of encroaching on my market, like, what happens in that situation?
Yeah, these markets sometimes operate in parallel, but on different levels. So if you're a big player and you're, like, as you say, a drug lord, you're going to be operating at a high level. You're going to have a series of underlings working for you, and you're going to be dealing your drugs at the street level. Let's say in the downtown, the Lower East Side of Vancouver, where you're going to have people operating on that level that are pushing out your drugs. But that doesn't mean that same drug lord has any influence over another neighborhood in another part of the Lower Mainland or in Victoria. They might not really be dealing out there So in the example with Victoria, we had that UVic student. Well, the people he was dealing with, the 50 or so students, they didn't want to buy from drug lords. They didn't want to buy from people in organized crime. They just wanted to buy with somebody that they knew. So he had his own little pocket of influence. And as long as these people kind of play nice in the sandbox and stay out of each other's way, they can sometimes get along. Not all the time. When you get the major drug lord versus the major drug lord competing for the same area, then you get what you see here in the Lower Mainland, which is a gang conflict.
Right. Just curious, how much was that UVic student making?
Calm down, dude.
It's not worth it. Nothing is worth it. So no, but it was quite remarkable because he literally would text out to about 50 customers when he was re-upped or resupplied. He would send out a message and it would say, I've got fresh, it was actually ketamine, and he would say, I've got fresh ketamine, MDMA, and he was mixing fentanyl. He was making his own pills. And he would push out an advertisement, and then he would wait for the customers to come rolling in.
And the reason I ask, I'm sort of partially being facetious, but like I'll put a question out to the group. Like, Chris, like, what do you think somebody who's addicted to fentanyl, how much they might spend in a day on fentanyl?
I mean,
Low and high.
I'm going to just go with like $200 a day.
Yeah. No, you're bang on. Like between $100 to $300 to $400 a day. Right. And you can imagine many of these people, not all of them, but many of them can be essentially, if no fixed address, so essentially homeless without a source of income, but they're spending.
I mean, tell me they collect $200 worth of cans every day? Every day.
Yeah. I mean, Conor, like, tell us about that.
Yeah, where do they get the money?
Right.
Couple different places, and some of them are really terrible. So a lot of people that are working in the like the sex industry, sex trade, and they're using the profits from that enterprise to pay for heroin or fentanyl addiction or a cocaine or methamphetamine addiction. $100, $200 a day is completely normal. Mm-hmm. A lot of petty crime, like shoplifting, right? So shoplifting right now across the nation is absolutely out of control. It's high-end stores like your Lululemon, high-end clothing stores. They see people walk in and with a garbage bag, and they will just grab 10 items off a shelf. Each item is worth $200, shove it in a garbage bag, and just beeline for the door. And the staff is basically told, don't get involved.
Yeah, I heard
so
that.
this just becomes an easy source of cash. Those clothes are converted into cash within an hour. There's always a market, whether it's Facebook Marketplace would be a simple one, or any number of online platforms, and that's converted into cash, and that cash is just turned into drugs within a few hours. So break-ins to cars, and then you get, some people deal drugs, take some of the profits from dealing the drugs and use it to buy drugs themselves.
Yeah. And some people really, truly will bottle and can.
They will.
Yeah. And like sometimes the perception is like, okay, these people are like, they're lazy or they don't want to work. They work extremely hard to come up with the money and to be able to support their addiction, which is interesting in of itself because I've had a number of patients. Not everybody who uses fentanyl certainly does crime, but a certain percentage do, and I don't know what that percentage is. But I don't want to paint that picture. But many of my patients will tell me that like their primary day in, day out routine is essentially doing whatever they need to do to get the money to use. Because the withdrawal from opioids is terrible, and the withdrawal from fentanyl in particular is particularly bad.
Well, I could talk about that for a second because I actually use a pretty simple analogy to teach young police officers at the police academy what addiction might feel like, right? So if you think about your own body and you think about what it's like to be hungry, right? So the typical adult male needs about 2,000 calories per day, right? So, but when we eat and we eat the right number of calories, our body feels satiated. You don't feel hungry. You're good. You're good for a few hours. The craving has been satisfied. Drug addiction can be thought of similarly in that when somebody who has a deficit for drugs, let's say it's fentanyl, when they take the fentanyl, that activates that satiation in their brain, and they're good for a little while. They're no longer drug seeking. But what I say to these young police officers, I say is, if I were to take adult male, 2,000 calories, and I say, look, I'm going to reduce your caloric intake to 500 calories a day, you're never going to feel the satiation. You're always going to feel hungry. Your brain's going to be telling you, we have to get food. And in fact, you're going to be consumed by searching for food and thinking about food. But really, 500 or 1,000 calories, you're not going to starve to death. Physically, you're actually going to be okay. You're not going to die, but your brain is telling you, but we're not satiated. Something is missing. We need more. And of course, I can tell you from my own personal experience, I would be consumed by acquiring food. And in many ways, people who are using fentanyl and heroin, as you mentioned, all day long, they're just drug seeking.
Yeah. It's unfortunate because I did have individuals with lived experience lined up to join us. They weren't able to, but I do hope to supplement this recording, this podcast, with that interview as well, because I think it's really important to hear from people who have had that firsthand experience. I need to take a 1-minute break and answer a couple of clinical texts.
Sure.
Can we do that?
Yeah, I'm still going. You can do whatever you want. I'm still stuck on the. You think the shipping companies should hold any sort of, like, is there anything there? Because that seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, they do work with us.
Do they?
They do work with us. Yeah, they actually but they're, put it this way, there is about 500,000.
I hate to interrupt. I have to open the door. It might make noise. Should we hold that?
We'll hold.
Ask that question again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1 minute. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm learning stuff from Korey I had never heard before. So
No, it's really cool to hear your perspective of it too. I know some of the, I guess, anecdotal kind of background of it. I've been in the lab, and like I said, I've made fentanyl analogs, but we've made ones that are intentionally less toxic, less potent. Even so, it's safe for me to handle, or other chemists in the lab, right? Because when you have something like fentanyl, people talk about like the lethal dose, and there are these famous pictures all over the place. I know you've definitely seen them. It's a few grains of salt. 2 milligrams is enough to kill the average person. And then you move to something like carfentanil, which is another synthetic fentanyl analog, and it's 0.2 milligrams, so like 200 micrograms, which is like a fraction of a single grain of salt. That if you ingest that, have it like touch your tongue, any method of ingestion, like if it was somehow injected, some contaminated drug sample, smoked, whatever, you're dead on the spot.
That like can get picked up in the air.
That's a different story. I'm sure you know that story too. That's that was a concern for a while, and there was I believe at least a falsified story about that where again, you can probably speak on this better than me, but where officers were worried about fentanyl related busts or somebody that was overdosing. They're worried about particles being picked up in the air and them reaching a lethal dose just from inhalation and things like that.
Yeah.
And there were a few reported cases where I think officers had some effects from it, but they believe that it was more likely to have been panic attack from knowing that fentanyl was kind of on the scene, that there weren't actual overdoses. Again, I'm sure you've heard of those stories.
But it
crazy
is.
to
But
me, man.
Korey's right. It is like if you get it on your hand and you put it in your eye, or you inhale it or get it into your body, it's problematic. But what Korey's talking about he's entirely right. But we were so afraid of an accidental fentanyl exposure that we spent, law enforcement across North America spent millions of dollars on personal protective equipment. Like before COVID-19, we already had the N100 masks, all that.
Yeah.
We had all that stuff, right? So we've kind of learned now that if it doesn't really get airborne very easily, or you're not likely to get it off a person when you're treating them medicinally. But it took a long time. It took nearly 10 years to get to this place where we have a better understanding of the toxicity of just touching people. But it's still, we still have a lot of precautions.
I mean, I got mangled a few times with poison oak. And if it's
Just the same.
if it did what that did and has the effect of that, I mean, then you're in some serious I Am Legend stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, I know
wiping out things,
that was a big concern when I started working with it in the lab too.
like breathing it in and stuff.
Well, I mean, I talked to Glenn about that. I feel a little naive about it now, but I mean, I think this is how anyone feels when they first encounter the stuff. It's just so so potent and such a high chance for fatality when you have no opioid tolerance, no exposure to opioids whatsoever. I mean, your body's naive to these compounds, right? So I was worried about accidental exposure. I mean, I'm handling this stuff and I was making these analogs in well over 2 milligram quantities, which is why I wanted to work with less toxic, less potent analogs for my own safety and everyone around. But it's just they don't easily get into the air. They're not absorbed through the skin or anything. There has to be some actual route of administration. You either have to ingest it, like you mentioned. If you have it on your hands, then that's concerning because, I mean, you touch your eyes, you touch your mouth, like anything, then that can get into your body. But it's not just going to go through the skin on its own. You're not going to inhale it.
You can get fentanyl if you touch your eyeball, it will go in your eye, and
any mucous membrane can take in a compound like that, especially if it's in the salt form because it's got greater water solubility, and that's how a lot of these opioids are found. They're in the salt form, and they're way more water soluble, which means any plasma membrane of your body or route of ingestion, it's dissolved, and then
Damn. And I read that like is that like an elephant tranquilizer type of? I mean, just to gain the size of what it can take down.
It's funny, actually. I have a bit of a personal story to tell about this stuff after too, involving a family member. Not in terms of illicit use, but just kind of a sad scenario nonetheless. But it's crazy to see the scaling up. You go from heroin, which was so potent, and you hear about rock stars, movie stars, people using this throughout the 70s, 80s, and how lethal it can be. Then you move to fentanyl, which is 10 to 12 times more potent than heroin. And then you move to carfentanil. And carfentanil, as far as I know, and Pouya, you can probably speak on this better than me, but carfentanil has no approved use in humans, as far as I'm aware, right?
Oh, it's not.
Because it's so potent. Like I said, that's then 10 to 100 times more potent than even fentanyl is.
So the term elephant tranquilizer is just like that's the only approved use. It has to be large animal sedation, and that's it. Because for any other organism, it's death. And the only way to accurately measure something like that, like when you're working with quantities as low as 200 micrograms that can kill you, the only way to do that is huge batches, right? To average it out. So you would have to take, say, a gram of the stuff and dissolve it and dilute it and have small aliquots, small samples, vials basically, and then deliver controlled doses to whatever organism. So if you're a human handling any of that stuff, that's terrifying to me. Like I'm not scared of many chemicals, many compounds in the lab. That stuff terrifies me.
When we had when fentanyl was blowing up all over our neighborhoods, there were people who talked to me and said, "Do you think we'll see carfentanil?" Because, like Korey said, it's so deadly in small quantities, really concerning. And I would actually say to the police officer I work with, "No, that will never happen. There's no way we'll see carfentanil. It's just being 10,000 times or something like that more potent than morphine. There's no way that would ever get into our drug supply because there's no way drug dealers could control it properly. It's lethal in such small quantities." And I remember the day we arrested a drug dealer. We had a couple of, we call it like ounce bags. An ounce is a typical drug size. A couple of ounce bags, and we sampled it in our police department. We have a lab in there. And we used an ion scanner, which is the same that you would see in the airport when they swab your suitcase. So we have an ion scanner, and we fired it onto the ion scanner, and I just couldn't believe it. It was the first reading of carfentanil. That was probably about 2018, 2019. And all of a sudden, it was an eye-opener for me. It was our first detection of carfentanil on Vancouver Island. And within a year, we started seeing something like maybe 5-10% of the illicit drug supply was carfentanil. It has kind of decreased from that kind of peak period. I think it is just very difficult for people to control, but there's so many other analogs out there. Fentanyl, we say fentanyl, but when we talk about fentanyl, we're really not talking about what we mean, which is a whole bunch of fentanyl analogs, which are way more potent than just traditional fentanyl.
So how would they, like, what is the purpose? If you can't even ingest it, like, what's the point?
I think it's, again,
like they mix it?
Yeah, fentanyl is just a cheap alternative to heroin originally, right? It's more potent, it's cheaper to make, it's easier to get. So even if you have a small fentanyl sample, a small heroin sample, and you cut it with fentanyl, then you're just able to make more money. And carfentanil being even more potent, I mean, you put less of it in, you're getting the same effect. And it is really hard to weigh it accurately, to measure it, for it to be safe to virtually any user. But I think a lot of these drug dealers are either ignorant to it or just trying to play a numbers game where you take a large enough batch of heroin or, like you said, ketamine, MDMA, whatever you want to cut in the fentanyl or fentanyl analog into. If you take a large enough batch and you tell yourself, if I mix this well enough, that's say 2 milligrams of carfentanil that I mix in, it should be evenly dispersed, right? And they don't have a good way of checking that. They don't have any way of guaranteeing that. So you're really playing a pretty dangerous game. You could give 100 doses of this and 99 of them could be safe, but the one dose that maybe has a crystal that wasn't broken down fine enough of carfentanil, a single granule of it, if that stuff's not super finely powdered and uniformly mixed, then that dose could be the bad one. And it could kill someone instantly.
Oh, jeez. So, like, why do you think drug dealers would sell this stuff if they know that it's going to do what it does to people? Like, I mean, if in such small quantities, if they're going to,
Well, you can kind of look at that for all these fentanyls and fentanyl analogs. I get that question all the time: is why do drug dealers sell this stuff when they're killing their clientele?
Yeah.
A couple of things to consider about that is that, first of all, they don't care about anybody. They don't have any concern whatsoever. If you're a mid-level or high-level drug dealer, they don't care about your sons and daughters and family members. They don't care about any of us whatsoever. That they're ruthless, mercantile. They want to make money, and the way they look at it is this: yeah, some people are going to die, but there's still enough people buying the drugs that there's going to be still clients for our product, and there's always going to be a new wave of new users. It's kind of like people are we're a renewable resource. There's always somebody.
Humans are.
Yeah, coming into age and addiction, and there's more clients. And what we have found, and I have talked to drug dealers about this, when things get tighter or tougher, laws get more restricted, they don't stop. They double down to make as much money as they possibly can while that window of opportunity is still open before the window closes. So they do not care about anybody.
And what I've heard from some of my patients is if they know of a particular batch or particular dealer whose customers are dying of overdose, then that might signal to them that they have the really good stuff, right? And the people that were using it, maybe they weren't experienced or they weren't using it appropriately, but like that's where the really strong stuff is going to be. Have you heard that as well?
Oh, absolutely. You probably remember that even before there was fentanyl in the market, when there was just potent heroin, there was really potent heroin from Afghanistan, and health authorities would put out public warnings and they would say, there is a very powerful batch of heroin circulating, let's call it in the downtown east side or wherever. And that was meant to warn people against it, but it would actually serve as an advertisement for it, because a powerful batch would have people go to the area and try to get their hands on it.
That's right.
So they had to change the wording to toxic. There's a toxic batch or a toxic supply or a toxic amount, which I don't entirely think works any differently, because the truth is that people in the throes of living with a substance use disorder, particularly people living really hard on the street, they truly want the best stuff and the most potent stuff. Why you call it toxic, they might call it potent. What they don't necessarily want is some of the additives or the cuts or the adulterants that are in the drugs. And we haven't even talked about that, but there's a whole sea of other drugs that make their way into fentanyl. We have a situation where you have fentanyl cut with benzodiazepines, fentanyl cut with nitazines, and fentanyl cut with xylazine. All these weird chemicals, none of which mostly don't have any role in human medicine. They're not made for human consumption, but they're cut into fentanyl to change the way it acts in the human body. All of it terrible.
And I think that's an interesting point, because, again, sort of the way the drug market evolved, it seemed like, okay, we went from heroin to heroin with fentanyl to fentanyl only. But I think fentanyl only in of itself wasn't necessarily as marketable because it didn't have the legs.
Yeah.
It just didn't last as long. So then you started seeing heroin being added back into the fentanyl, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we saw that. We saw that specifically was heroin being added back into the fentanyl, and you would get some compound of heroin and fentanyl. But what the drug dealers found was that they couldn't get their hands on heroin because the heroin market collapsed in North America because it was not profitable to sell heroin on its own. So they couldn't even find the heroin when they wanted to. So they started using things like benzodiazepines. We're all familiar with benzodiazepines. We might know them by that name, but we think of things like lorazepam or alprazolam or drugs that are used as a sort of a mildish sedative for anxiety.
Like Valium is sort of the most common, I think, lay term.
There you go.
May recognize. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
And so, Pouya, you're entirely right. The fentanyl on its own has actually a very short duration of effect. That could be just a matter of a few minutes before that the effects peak and then they come down and the person feels way worse than the way they did before they took the fentanyl. Heroin had actually quite a lengthy period of effects. Could be measured up to an hour or beyond, several hours beyond. Fentanyl alone, it peaks really quickly, no legs, and people are like, what the heck, I got to go buy more fentanyl. They wanted something with both the peak and the duration. So drug dealers said, okay, let's make them what they want. And they just couldn't get heroin, so they bought benzodiazepines and adulterated them into the fentanyl, and now you get kind of like the best of both worlds, to use that term kind of weirdly.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's difficult now to get fentanyl that does not have benzodiazepines in it. So it's called benzodope, essentially, right? And okay, so the sedation will last longer, but what we know is there's essentially 2 or 3, maybe 4 molecules that will kill you in withdrawal, right? So you can say alcohol is one of those, benzodiazepines, maybe barbiturates and GHB, essentially, but all within the same class. And so now you have individuals that are using fentanyl but are becoming physiologically dependent on benzodiazepines. So when they go into opioid withdrawal, they're also entering into benzodiazepine withdrawal. And that can be quite dangerous. And it can result in death, seizures and death. So where, like in the past, seizures were never really part of a opioid withdrawal syndrome, but now you have people who are in opioid withdrawal developing seizures, but really they're in opioid and benzodiazepine withdrawal, which makes it clinically much more difficult to manage.
And of course, as you know, here's one of these weird situations that's developed again. Initially, when fentanyl was cut with benzodiazepines, people who were using it said, we just want fentanyl alone, or we want fentanyl and heroin. We don't want benzodiazepines. We don't like the effect. Sure, we want longevity, but not this stuff. Now people are seeking it out because they have become addicted to the fentanyl benzodiazepine compound. They seek it out and they have to have it. It's a crazy side effect of the situation.
Right. And whereas in the past, let's just say, but opioid withdrawal is terrible. It's and people don't fully understand the syndrome of opioid withdrawal. I describe it as anything that could possibly leak from your body is leaking. So through your skin, you're sweating, your eyes are tearing, your nose is running, you're vomiting, you have diarrhea, terrible nausea, full body pains, flu-like symptoms, severe anxiety, tremors, shakes. It's horrible. But in of itself won't kill you. So now even if somebody was in a situation where they wanted to detox themselves, or they were put in a place where they were going to detox off of the opioids, which is not something we recommend clinically these days anyways, but if you can't, because the benzo withdrawal will kick in and that can kill you. So you're even more hooked onto the substances that you're getting from your dealers. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you don't buy from your dealers, the consequence can be death at this point, whereas before it was just withdrawal.
Yeah.
The other question is, now you're seeing, so it was benzodiazepines, but now you're actually seeing xylazine, isn't it? So that's called trank dope.
Yeah.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'll give you the layperson's version of xylazine, and then I'll go to Korey for the science. So, it's called trank dope, and
that's right.
It's essentially an animal tranquilizer, right? So again, not at all designed, never meant to be used by humans, but it has that powerful sedative effect. It's a great additive to fentanyl to provide the legs. it's really, really exploding in different parts of the United States. Thankfully, in Canada, we're not seeing this explosion. It was described in the U.S. as an emerging threat. Here, we're keeping our eye on it, but it's not as crazy as it is in the U.S. But I think Korey can probably provide the chemistry.
I actually don't know nearly as much about xylazine. Sorry to disappoint, but no, much less familiar with that. I know it's used as a sort of tranquilizer. I know it's been used in combination with ketamine before and that, but I know quite little about it in terms of its role in combination with.
It's essentially alpha adrenergic sort of alpha agonist, and no role in human medicine, but it's like you said, it's often combined with ketamine for as an animal tranquilizer.
Yeah. It's just strange for it to pop up again. For that to be the choice, like from a chemist perspective, if you were to choose what drug to combine with fentanyl or with heroin, even to give to clientele, right? If you were a drug dealer, it's an odd choice, and I get that it still has those kind of sedative effects. Maybe it keeps you calm from the come down from fentanyl. Maybe it makes you feel that euphoric effect a little bit longer, the analgesic effect. But it's just, again, such a strong and such a odd choice.
Can you get these online too? Like you can order them as well, and they come through the mail as well?
Yeah, exactly. There is a strong market for all of these drugs we talked about: xylazine, nitazines, benzodiazepines. They can be ordered from the PRC, People's Republic of China. They can be ordered from South Korea, from Hong Kong, and they can even be ordered from India. And they're infinitely more affordable than fentanyl. So they can be mixed in. Either the higher end drug dealers mix them in higher up on the sort of distribution food chain, or they can be mixed in just right before the drugs hit the street. They can be mixed in by the guy who's got 50 clients and he just wants to like double the amount of dope that he's got to sell. He'll just mix in a bunch of this crap and then repackage it and push it out onto the street.
That's crazy. And to go back to, you said you were working with like the companies that like FedEx, whatever, FedExing through. You think they should hold any kind of up there? Is there a invasion of privacy thing going on there with people's packages or something? Like, how do we?
Yeah, they've been pretty good partners. They're kind of caught in a bad spot where, like I would say, put your hand up if you've never ordered anything on Amazon. Yeah. So if you've ordered something on Amazon, then you're not part of the problem, but you're part of the system, right? So we all order stuff. It comes to us globally. A lot of it comes from China. We want this stuff delivered. We want it brought in by, like I said, FedEx or Canada Post or UPS. About 500,000 pieces of mail arrive in Vancouver at the Vancouver Mail and Clearing Center every week from Asia. They can't search 500,000 pieces of mail, and there's economic reasons. We want our stuff. We're a country that wants our stuff, and we want it delivered on time. So they work in partnership with a Canada Border Service Agency, which is actually the federal agency responsible for finding these drugs inside these packages. And they have a number of tools that they will use to do that. Sometimes that's as simple as an X-ray. Sometimes it's other chemical scanning devices. Sometimes it's dogs. Sometimes it's physical human checks. But the best camouflage for the surreptitious or the secret trafficking of items, the best camouflage is volume. Volume is the drug dealer's best friend, meaning if there's 500,000 pieces of mail coming in, you put in 1,000 drug packages, the chances of those 1,000 being found are so slim because there just isn't enough officers to search all these packages. We don't have the technology to search them all. And so, like I said, these companies that bring in the mail, they do cooperate. They're pretty good corporate partners. They do the best they can, but they're just part of the system as well. When the package arrives at their office in China, it's already packed up and ready to go. There's no way they can possibly search all these things.
So like if you're some guy at like UVic or something and you're ordering from China, it goes to your address?
Yeah,
that seems ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, what people do, what organized crime does, are a little bit more switched on. What they do is they find a nominee. So they find somebody who they'll approach them and they'll say, look, we want packages to come to your apartment. They might come once a month. When the package arrives, you sign for it, you call us, we'll come and get it, we'll pay you like $1,000 a package. So that's a nominee. This person is kind of like a flunky. They're just like a nobody. But that's the first stage of the organized crime group protecting themselves from law enforcement. So that's exactly what happened with us in Victoria, one particular case where Canada Border Service Agency reported to us that they had intercepted a package that was 1 kilogram of fentanyl, and it was coming to a particular guy's address in Victoria. When we checked that address, we learned that that guy was such a low-end guy. He was barely a drug dealer of any kind of stature whatsoever, but organized criminals had approached him and said, you take the packages and we'll pay you money and we'll come get them. So what we did, we actually dressed up one of our police officers in a Canada Post uniform, used a Canada Post truck, and we delivered a fake package to that address. And he took receipt of the fake package. He called the organized criminals. They came and they picked up the package, and we followed that package to the actual address it was meant for. We executed a search warrant in that address, and we got, I think it was about 8 kilograms of fentanyl ready to go out onto the street.
Damn, and there's a structure of like the drug deal network, I'm assuming, right? And can you trace it all the way back, or is it impossible? Like they just go?
No, it's not impossible. It can be tricky to trace back. It can require a lot of surveillance, watching criminals, see who they meet with. It can require things like wiretaps on telephones to see who they're talking to. It can require human sources to come forward and give you information on the structure of organized crime groups. But there's way more of them than there is of us, and we only have so many hours in the day. Yeah. So if we had unlimited budgets and unlimited manpower, we could probably do more. But right now we're just kind of working with a finite amount of resources, and they have no rules and essentially unlimited budgets.
And what does that structure look like? I'm guessing you have, from the movies, you have the Godfather figure at the very top, and you have it sort of branches down to the street level drug runners. Can you describe that structure?
Yeah, sure. So you typically don't necessarily have one so-called Godfather, but you have a core group of high-level criminals who are have been around the block for 10, 20 years. They know the game. And so they'll get together and they'll say, let's get involved in the fentanyl importation business. So I'll use the example of what's going on right now, which is that British Columbia is a fentanyl production area of the country, right? So what these guys will do is they'll say, all right, okay, somebody from our group has got connections in China. They'll go over, have discussions with criminals also operating in China. And there's a lot of connectivity between organized crime groups in China and in British Columbia. So they'll go over and they'll say, your lab's going to produce fentanyl for us, or in this case, precursors, drugs that are turned into fentanyl. Yeah, that's correct. We're going to produce it for you. We're going to put it into marine shipping containers in a city in China, and we're going to send it across the Pacific to the port of Vancouver. Okay, so somebody else in the group has got connections at the port, right? They have corrupted some workers at the port who do unloading of containers. So they've got that piece figured out. They've got the fentanyl production figured out, or the precursor production figured out. They've got the trafficking across the ocean on their freighter. They've got the arrival at the port of Vancouver figured out. So that's all the big pieces. Once the precursor drug comes to Vancouver, then they've got somebody else who their job is running the fentanyl labs. So that might be out somewhere in some rural property way outside of the Lower Mainland. They've got a couple of big properties, acreages, and in the back in some barns, they'll have fentanyl labs. So somebody else's job is to bring the chemicals out there. They'll cook up the fentanyl, and this is what's going on right now. This province is producing hundreds of kilos of fentanyl every month. And so somebody's job is to run the cooks. The cooks make the fentanyl. Then someone else's job from that group is now there goes over to the distribution piece of the puzzle. The distributors will have their fingers on all the crime groups in the cities who buy the fentanyl from these guys. They sell them the fentanyl, and then they have a network of mid and low, and then really low, right down to the street level dealers. That could be hundreds of people. And along the way, money changes hands. Either this one crime group are in control of the fentanyl all the way till it hits the streets, or they get to a place where they just sell it off at the kilo level or sell it off at the ounce level, and it gets distributed into the community.
Right. And that's an interesting shift as well, isn't it? Because initially it was fentanyl only being produced in China and being brought here. And then there was a shift where now precursors were coming and the final product was being synthesized here. And like Korey, like my impression was always that fentanyl is not like methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, like most people can figure out how to synthesize methamphetamine if they really wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They could get the precursors. We're not obviously going to get into those details, but fentanyl, my impression was that it was like a different ball game. Like you needed specialized equipment, you needed a chemist involved. Like, how difficult is it?
Yeah. So just kind of going off of what you said about like methamphetamine synthesis. I mean, everyone knows the show Breaking Bad. Everyone sees the super labs that are eventually set up in that show, and the way you mainly access this stuff. Again, I don't want to disclose a bunch of stuff or make it sound like an advertisement for the synthesis of any of these things. But if anyone's seen that show, they know that initially they have people running and getting like Sudafed tablets, right? You have pseudoephedrine tablets, and you're deriving meth from that. There are a few different ways of making methamphetamine, but even some of those steps are actually sort of specialized steps that require some training to handle.
And are dangerous.
Yeah, and are quite dangerous. Either the byproducts of it or the reaction itself can be quite dangerous. The reagents that you're handling, any of it. You can have a non-trained chemist carrying it out, but to achieve the level of purity that I think would be expected, you have to have at least some chemical training or some process training. Whereas, again, this is really concerning for me to say, and I hesitate to say it, but with fentanyl, you could have a non-trained chemist make it.
Wait, so you're saying it's easier than methamphetamine?
In my opinion, I believe it is easier. Accessing the reagents is probably more difficult because there are a lot of kind of clandestine access routes for meth and for the reagents required to make meth. Again, even Sudafed tablets, people using lithium strips from batteries for reactions, things like that. But for fentanyl, you need the actual reagents, you need the solvents. But in terms of actually carrying out these chemical steps, it's literally like following a recipe. If you took a recipe out of a recipe book and just had somebody follow it along, they could get to fentanyl in reasonable purity. It's not going to be 90+% pure. It's probably not going to be a white powder or anything, but you can make it fairly easily. Again, what we're doing in the lab setting and working with these less potent fentanyl analogs, again, to calibrate testing systems and stuff, that's a much more controlled environment. We're trying to make these in super high purity, small samples, and we're kind of changing the structure to not even to look at the potency. We're working with only compounds that we know are less potent, but we're doing it to sort of modulate the electronics and try to give us different signals for the detection system that we're actually developing. But in terms of a lab that's just producing fentanyl, when you don't care that much about purity, I mean, it is quite easy to make, concerningly easy.
Okay. So, but still precursors are coming from China to British Columbia.
Yeah.
Can we get into a situation where that's no longer required either? We can sort of, everything can be done in-house? Has that?
I don't know about the legal side of it. I mean, you could better comment on this, but in terms of accessing the chemicals, certain commodity chemicals, they're derived from some natural source or some industrial process, right? That's where a lot of these chemicals come from, either the oil industry or petroleum or, again, just different commodity chemicals, different processes. The ones that you need to make fentanyl are heavily regulated. Even for us in the lab, what we work with, I had to fill out a whole host of paperwork for Health Canada, for different regulatory agencies in order to obtain this stuff. And this was to obtain them in small quantities, explaining the end processing of these compounds, that we make them in small quantities. They go for testing and for calibration of the system that we're working on. and then they're destroyed, and that's it. There's no chance of any of this slipping outside of our lab. And these are really, really small amounts. So on the industrial scale, I imagine it is quite hard to get your hands on large amounts, and there's not really a way that they could be made in-house. There's not really a way to access these chemicals other than being a chemical production company or having access to these byproducts of, again, the oil or petroleum industry. I hope that there's never a way for these to be accessed that easily in-house, because that could just make things decline to an even greater extent.
The situation we face, though, is that we are likely never going to be able to stop these chemicals from arriving. Like, that's the piece of this that we should all kind of understand. We have an open border country, more or less. Again, I've mentioned the Port of Vancouver. The Port of Vancouver sees 3 million canisters, sea cans, containers come in every year, 3 million. So that's 8,000 a day. So you put precursor chemicals in 100 out of 8,000, there's no way those are going to be intercepted. So they come in and then they make their way into the fentanyl production system. So drug organized crime groups are incredibly maneuverable. And every time we have tried to schedule, ban, or intercept any of these precursor drugs, they have found a way to circumvent our bans. So people used to say to me during COVID-19, they would say, why are drugs exploding in the market? Why is there more drugs than ever before? Which there was. There was maybe 2 months where there was limited availability. That was just people hoarding drugs. But then after that, it exploded, and they would say, but the borders are closed. How is this possible? The borders are closed. And I would correct them and say, the borders are closed to you and me. We can't drive to Seattle for a ball game, that's for sure. But the borders are not closed to commercial traffic. There was thousands of trucks coming across the border from the United States into Canada. There were, again, millions of containers coming into the Port of Vancouver. There were commercial flights, cargo flights coming into Canada from Asia. And those are all ways where precursor drugs or drugs can come into our country. We cannot create an iron ring around our country and stop the flow of these drugs or precursors. There's always going to be some.
Right. And so have any of these labs been busted?
Yes, so they're busted on a continual basis. There is an RCMP team that specializes in busting clandestine labs, and they are really worried. They tell me these labs they're seeing more and more of them. They're the super labs that Korey mentioned, which is they produce multiple kilos per week. This isn't mom and pop lab in a bathroom of a seedy hotel. This is a multi-stage, sophisticated, huge aircraft carrier size or what's the word I'm looking for? Like a large barn, Quonset hut kind of operation with glassware, huge reaction vessels. It looks like, again, like Breaking Bad, but on steroids.
And is there a sense that this stuff is now also being synthesized in the U.S., or is it that Canadian stuff is making its way down there?
Yeah, so what's going on is there's something unique happening. In Canada, we have become a country that synthesizes our own fentanyl. We have a flood of fentanyl in our own domestic market. We have so much that there's a bit of a glut, and we have at least some indication that we are now sending fentanyl overseas. So for instance, we have seen fentanyl sent to New Zealand and seen Canadian fentanyl sent to Australia. So we've become a fentanyl exporter now, which is kind of remarkable for us in policing. But in the United States, they don't make their own fentanyl so much as they get their fentanyl from Mexico, because in Mexico there is just an absolute crazy environment of large areas of the country that are essentially lawless, and the Mexican cartels have very successfully set up massive fentanyl production laboratories. They produce it there, and then they bring it across the southwest border into the United States, and they are distributing it right through the U.S. So Canada is a little bit different. We have domestic fentanyl, and the U.S. has Mexican fentanyl.
Wow. Okay. Is there a sense of difference in terms of purity or potency?
No. All of it's really potent. All of it is way more potent than it ever used to be. The fentanyl that we were getting from China, and again, this I talk about unintended consequences, right? So the U.S. and Canadian governments worked really hard to get the government of China to cooperate with us and regulate or schedule fentanyl. It was unscheduled for a long time. They did in 2019, and that curbed the production of fentanyl in China. But what we didn't know was that it was going to shift to Mexico and to Canada. And then that shift, they changed actually the way they synthesize it. And the way they synthesize it now is much more effective, much more simple, and it produces a much more potent fentanyl. So we have a really terrible situation on the streets right now because we have more availability of more toxic drugs that are more affordable than ever before. I call it like the trifecta of terribleness, right? And that's what's happening right now on the streets. And the one thing that I always want to remind people when I talk about fentanyl is that I talked about fentanyl trafficking being like the great equalizer, like anybody can get involved. But in my experience as well, people using fentanyl, this has revealed to us that there are people using fentanyl from all walks of life. And I always think about this event that happened in Victoria around about, it was actually Christmas of 2016. This was when we were first getting a handle on the level of trouble we were in, the level of overdoses that we were in. That Christmas of 2016 sticks out in my mind because fentanyl it was creeping in, and then all of a sudden it exploded in our faces, certainly in policing. So through December, I had been tracking overdose deaths in my office at the police department, and I went home for Christmas Eve. I had 4 days off for Christmas, and I had my laptop, and I had told the officers, the watch commanders who work 24/7 in the patrol division, I had said, when you have an overdose, can you call me or email me, let me know? Because I was literally taking track of them with a notepad and pen. And they called 3 or 4 times on Christmas Eve, 6 times on Christmas Day. And then finally the watch commander said, can we just email you at the end of the shift? Because there were so many overdoses that were happening. On Boxing Day, they called me and said, we've got a whole batch more, and then there's some in some rural areas. And there was an overdose in Souk, which is a neighborhood right beside Victoria. And within a few hours, I discovered that one of the people who overdosed in Souk was a 22-year-old girl whose mom worked down the hall from me in the police department.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was the first time that somebody that I directly knew had died from a fentanyl overdose. But it was the opening of a door where I realized that within about 10 years, or I guess not 10 years, here we are in 2024, I think everybody knows somebody who's died from a drug overdose. It didn't used to be that way. It didn't feel that way to me when we had just had heroin. But now with 7 deaths a day, everybody knows somebody. And I know 5 people. And I used to go to a barber shop on 4th Street in Victoria. One day I walked in and the barber was gone. The chair was empty. And there was a picture of the barber up on the wall. And I said, I bet you he's dead from a drug overdose. And sure enough, he was. And that's just how it is. That's how it is.
Yeah. Korey, you were saying that there was a personal anecdote you wanted to share?
Yeah. So it's funny timing too when you're saying knowing people who have been affected by drugs. Luckily, mine's not a case of overdose, but it's actually how young and kind of before this whole epidemic, when I was first exposed or just started to learn of fentanyl. It was actually from my grandfather. And this was, I guess, before I was technically a trained chemist or anything. This is when I was still developing my interest in chemistry and wanting to learn more about mainly natural products, things that have biological activity, and just like fascinated by the effects they can have on the body. But I was always fascinated by drugs too, and why people are addicted to them, why people want to try them. I myself have never messed with drugs at all, like never touched them. Always just had a healthy fear of them. Knew enough about them because of chemistry that I didn't even want to chance it, didn't want to mess with it. But my grandfather, he unfortunately had chronic pain throughout a lot of his life from his mid-20s, mostly related to arthritis. And so when he was quite young, he was prescribed painkillers like oxycodone and other ones. And from, multiple decades of treatment with these painkillers, he developed tolerance, of course. And luckily we still had him around for quite a while, even throughout my life, but he still passed away fairly young. And by the end of his life, he was being treated with fentanyl for arthritis. And it was just, I don't see it as a bad thing in terms of the way the doctors handled it or the dosing. It's just he had developed such a tolerance. That's what was needed just to keep his status quo, just to keep him functioning throughout the day. And at the time, I remember I was fascinated by the use of fentanyl for someone like him, where it was largely arthritis-based pain, but he was in such a high degree of pain. Like his joints had deteriorated to the point you could actually hear bone-on-bone contact when he was moving. And so he needed this potent of an analgesic just to help him function. And at the time, I remember I would just look it up on my phone. I would look up fentanyl. This was new to me. It wasn't morphine anymore. It wasn't hydromorphone, oxycodone. It wasn't any of those opiates. It was this new synthetic opioid that, again, has been used for tranquilization of larger animals in the past and things like that. And I looked up the dose, and it was these transdermal patches. And I can't remember the dose that he was being given at the time, but I was just fascinated with the potency of it compared to morphine, compared to heroin. And I'm thinking, my poor grandfather, like he's using this and he's just able to function. He wasn't getting high from the stuff.
No. Yeah.
There was no analgesia. There was no, there was analgesia. There was no euphoria associated with his use. It wasn't, it was just to help him get by. And I looked this stuff up, and next thing I know, within a few years of me looking this up and first hearing about it, I start to see that people are using this recreationally. And I find out that the amount needed to get high from it recreationally is somewhere, I think it was about 1/10 or 100th of the dose that he was using at the time. And then I started to hear these stories too, that people would actually take the transdermal patches, and drug dealers, if they could source them, if they could grab them from somebody who was actually prescribed them, they would cut them up into, say, 10 by 10 squares. They would cut up a single patch into 100 little squares, and they'd be taken as tabs, almost like old acid tabs. And people just put it on their tongue, absorb the small amount of fentanyl from it, and they'd be high. And that'd be a hit of fentanyl. And I was like, this is terrifying. This is something that was needed by somebody who had chronic pain their whole life. And people are risking their lives to take this stuff recreationally, just the potency of it. But again, it was crazy to see the shift. It was before I had this understanding of the chemistry with fentanyl and around these sorts of drugs. A lot changed within a few years, like as you alluded to as well. And it really has been crazy to see.
Yeah. And I think something to clarify is you were mentioning that your grandfather wasn't getting high. In fact, many people who use fentanyl, like unregulated fentanyl or illicit fentanyl, at a certain point, because the way opioids work is you develop a tolerance to them, right? The more you take, the receptors change, they become less sensitive, you get receptor internalization, so you have less receptors that are less sensitive. So you essentially develop a tolerance to the opioid, and you need more and more and more to get the same effect.
Yep.
At the same time, the withdrawal becomes worse and worse and worse. So at a certain point in an individual's addiction, they're not partying, they're no longer getting high, they're solely using to avoid withdrawal. And their whole life revolves around avoiding withdrawal.
Yep.
Right? And what's interesting is then other drugs come into play. For instance, methamphetamine. Many patients tell me that they will use methamphetamine to stay awake at night, to do what they need to do to get the money to buy fentanyl, and then they're using fentanyl during the day, and then this cycle continues. So they don't necessarily have a awake sleep cycle. They sort of sleep when they can, but their entire existence revolves around obtaining fentanyl. But I think when we have these discussions, we run the risk of minimizing addiction just to like a biological process. Right? But I think it's much more than that, because fair enough, you have this terrible withdrawal, you have these intense cravings that's driving use. But also in many ways, that's the easiest thing to treat biologically. We have excellent treatments. We've been able to innovate new treatments, particularly here at our hospital, in Vancouver General Hospital. But with our new protocols, we can essentially get people off of unregulated illicit fentanyl very quickly onto sort of the treatment, which is opioid agonist therapy. But if it was that easy, we would not have this toxic drug death crisis, right? So what often happens is, we can rotate somebody onto the treatment for opioid addiction, which is sort of called opioid agonist therapy. They're oftentimes long-acting prescription opioids that are there to replace the fentanyl or the unregulated opioids. but we're discharging people often right back into the circumstance where they came in from.
Yep.
So we have this rotating. It's in many ways it's analogous to treating somebody for a gambling addiction in a facility and then discharging them right into a casino and saying good luck, right? And I think that speaks to the complexity of addiction. There's often many factors that are driving somebody's use, and we use this thing called the four squares, where it's like, okay, there's the biological driving factors, physical cravings and withdrawal. That's sometimes there's pain involved that drives opioid use, etc. That's the easiest part to treat. And there's like the psychiatric, psychological component. People will sometimes use substances as a means of escape or coping with difficult life circumstances, etc. Or they might be using substances to cope with underlying mental illness, severe depression, anxiety, psychosis, whatever it might be. And then there's the social component, which I think is extremely important, where some of the patients that I know that use fentanyl, when I ask them, do you have anybody in your life that you see on a daily basis that doesn't use fentanyl? They tell me no. So all of their attachment figures use fentanyl. Some of my young patients will use with their parents. So I've seen that as well. So you can imagine, for this person to not use, it would mean that they would have to sever those important attachment relationships, which is very difficult to do. And in addition to that, I'll ask them, okay, how much time goes by after you wake up before you encounter fentanyl? And they'll tell me I wake up and I smell in the hallway of my SRO, or there's people waiting in the hall to give it to me. So it's omnipresent in their physical environment. Many of their attachment figures are using with them. And so what's interesting, I used to work at this group home for youth, this beautiful home in East Van, not downtown East Side, but this beautiful house where they had their own bathroom and they had a view, etc. It was a very comfortable circumstance. But I would often, I would get patients in there, but then I would hear them talking oftentimes romantically about life in the downtown East Side. And when things would go bad, like they would get into an argument or something went sideways in the group home, they would be right back, oftentimes in the downtown East Side. And then it struck me, it's like what's more important than the comfort that they're experiencing in this group home is the relationships. And for better or worse, many of their important attachment figures might be there in the downtown East Side. So I sometimes use the analogy, like I could tell you, okay, I can get you this beautiful villa in the south of France. I can fly you there first class. You can live there, but you can never speak to any of your family or friends ever again, right? You would say no, right? And in some ways, getting people out of that circumstance, but they can't sort of associate with their attachment figures, friends and loved ones, is a big thing to ask.
So I love this part of the conversation, because this is where you guys are doing your good work, because it's about prevention. My experience with that is I get asked to go to schools more so in the past than now, and I would show up and there would be guidance counselors or teachers or parents, and they would say, hey, as a police officer, we want you to come and talk to our kids to get them to not use drugs. And at first, when I was a rookie cop, I would say, okay, sure, and I would show up with a sample of drugs, and I would talk about all the harms associated to using drugs for an hour. And I'd be like, yep, right. I'll get the toaster, I'm officer of the month, I get the toaster oven, I'm good. High fives all around, and I'm out of here. And of course, it was useless. It had it might have been a novelty kind of experience for them. It was something interesting they got out of, physics class for an hour, but that was about it. And then I came to learn that that was not at all what gets people to not become addicted to drugs. So for you guys, it's going to be like, how do you reach those kids who maybe need a role model or are inspired to get into a sport where the coach is that person? Because it can be that. It can be a coach, it can be a guidance counselor, it can be a favorite teacher. It can be a grandma. It just needs to be one person. Start with one and then go from there.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing about skating is that there never really was any coach. There was actually a lot of people got into it because there was no parental figures at all. It was like a kind of like this free, lawless kind of thing that they did by themselves, and their friends were there. So, but then we all came in together, and so there wasn't really. We all grew up together. We all did the same things together, and there was kind of like all right, well, we're just going to do what these guys have been doing. And back in the early 90s, I don't think a lot of the skateboard industry wasn't really portrayed as kind of like a, positive. I mean, it was awesome it looked like a good time. It just looked like the party, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
And there was anything goes, which is enticing for kids and stuff. But so that's what we're hoping to try and, with this stuff, trying to get across to them that there's actually all those people that were kids back in the day are now, 40, 50 years old, men, women, people that just have all these things. They've probably gotten through their fair share of substance stuff, or maybe not at all.
Yeah.
But just to know that, things have happened over the years that they could learn from or something, So
That being said, too, I definitely want to give some kudos to Chris as someone who is a pro skater and just being a positive role model. And just from the chats earlier in the hallway, before us chatting in here, saying that, I think you even said, been lucky enough to not deal with substance abuse yourself.
Yeah.
But for being a positive role model for people that, they can look up to you and realize that there's sort of this stigma around pro sports, pro skating, that there might be a lot of people using that, like many forms of pop culture, that it's sort of glorified, right? And you're being this positive influence that shows, you can be successful, you can enjoy what you do. You don't have to use the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you can party all you want to, but you don't. I mean, I've gone to parties. I never used any of it. So there's a a line that you can draw. And in skating's been the best thing, one of the best things in my whole life. And I mean, it got me very far. So introduced me to a lot of people, and I never touched this stuff. So I'm very fortunate that way. Yeah, but I mean, I have a lot of friends that, and a lot of people I know just through the industry that have taken other paths with it and stuff. So. Learning from other people's mistakes is a huge importance,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think, something that strikes me, and I always wonder about this, is, so I grew up skateboarding, but obviously I was never, pro level, sponsor level, etc. I just did it for fun, and I still skate. But I recall the profound influence professional skateboarders had on me and on my life. So one of the people that is profoundly impacting me was a skateboarder named Rodney Mullen. He's a very academic skater. And for me to see him, because I had a difficult time reconciling my skateboarding world with my academic world. And like Chris was alluding to, skaters were sort of like this punk group that weren't outcasts that weren't necessarily associated with academia, but I always wanted to be a doctor. And for me, having that role model of this professional skateboarder who's also very academic was important. It allowed me to reconcile those two worlds for myself. But I think, growing up as a kid who was an average kid who liked to skateboard, the influence that professional skateboarders had on our lives was profound. We would emulate them. We would dress like them. We'd want to talk like them. We'd want to do their skateboard tricks, etc. So that level of influence was huge. And what I've also found is the sphere of influence by pro skaters now is going beyond just skateboarding. I went to this skateboard event in California with Kevin Harris, who invited me to this Bones Brigade reunion. And it was amazing for me because I was going to meet many of my idols. And when I told some of the people at the hospital, my colleagues, the doctors and nurses, they were like, wow, Bones Brigade, Tony Hawk, Rodney Mullen. I was like, how do you even know these names? But they were so excited for me to go because they knew, so sort of like the sphere of influence had gone beyond just the skateboard world into sort of general public, which is interesting for me. So then to have pro skateboarders like Chris Haslam to put themselves out there and to deliver this messaging, I think can have a profound impact on young people, skaters and beyond.
Absolutely. So cool.
Well, I hope so. We'll see how big my influence is. Yeah.
It's a positive one nonetheless.
Hey, thank you.
That's right. Okay, so I think we're starting to wrap up, but was there anything, Conor, in terms of the drug trade, policing, enforcement, et cetera, that you think would be important for us to know that we haven't touched on?
I guess the only thing I would say, just to kind of conclude, is I like these kind of conversations, and I like the interest in the various people in the room here, whether they're on or off camera, really good people. And it actually is super heartwarming for me. And I know that's probably an odd thing for a police officer to say, but that's how I look at this. This this drug overdose situation we're in, this is an all of society problem. It affects everybody from every walk of life, rich and poor, housed and unhoused, educated and uneducated. As I said, I know people in my personal life and in my sphere and in my job that have died from drug overdose. It's an all of society problem that's going to require an all of society solution, as best as I can tell. The police cannot arrest our way out of the situation. I would say doctors can't treat us out of this situation. It's going to require just a lot of cooperation with people who don't normally interact with each other in spheres that don't obviously collide. But now we need to really cooperate. And I think it requires some pretty bold, creative thinking.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thank you so much for your time, for coming. Korey, yourself, any last thoughts?
Yeah, something I kind of wanted to speak on. I mean, I've mentioned it a few times, talking about how easy some of these chemicals are to make and these drugs, and just how concerning it can be. And I kind of want to speak to, I guess, anyone who is interested in science, chemistry, anything. Everyone sort of glorifies it, especially through things like Breaking Bad. But even people, when they talk to me, they find out I'm a chemist, and they're like, "Oh, are you like Walter White?" And they think, "Oh, you just cook meth." And everyone kind of glorifies it, thinking, cooking meth, making fentanyl, things like that. But like I said, pretty much anyone can do it. Anyone can do it, and that's concerning. So those that are actually trained and aspiring to have any sort of, I guess, impactful career, be a part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Like, if it's so easy to make fentanyl, what's so enticing about it? If you're not addicted, if you don't want to contribute to the problem, why would you want to do it, right? The analogs I'm making in the lab, I'm lucky enough to work with Dr. Samus at UBC and try to address some of those problems in collaboration with you as well, Pouya. And I'm really happy to be a part of that now. So just kind of a call to any scientists, and as Conor said, like anybody in society, be a part of the solution. Really try to work together towards this, towards the preventative measures, the I guess, mitigating the risk of drug abuse and just encountering drugs in general. And yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. And thank you for your time as well. I think that I agree with you 100%. Like there was a time where physicians, particularly in all fields of clinical medicine, would work sort of in separation from scientists, right? And innovation would often come from scientists down to physicians, and the clinical applications wouldn't necessarily be there. But I think what we're doing with Professor Sammys, Professor Bazardo, you guys all together is working hand in hand to come up with clinical solutions using basic science, which is a little bit different than how it's been done in the past, but we're coming up with some really cool stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, appreciate you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.